Hello everyone and welcome to Your Average Bear. I'm George and today we'll be painting the Astra Militarum Wyvren / Hydra. It's a kit I magnetized in the previous video and today we're going to paint it up in a step-by-step process so you can see how I used glazes and washes with a little bit of detail to make this tank look really nice without spending a ton of time. Interested? I hope so. Otherwise it's going to be very awkward. Anyway, let's roll it. This Wyvren / Hydra tank, vehicle, whatever, is going to be my first vehicle for my small and probably, will always be a small army of Imperial Guard. And I featured it in a different video. I magnetized this guy. I finished a big project and I really wanted to do something a little different. I needed a palette cleanser. And I thought, well, this Wyvren might be a cool kit to do, and it has been so far. I haven't encountered a lot of the major issues that I've encountered in the past with vehicles, not fitting well or what have you. The issue I did encounter with it is that it has two variants, right? It has the Wyvren and the Hydra, which is the anti-aircraft thing. I think the Wyvern is the indirect fire version of that tank, but I'm not exactly sure on what it does. I'm waiting for the new Imperial Guard Codex to come out, whenever that is, before I kind of read about how to use these models. I just like the Army Men aesthetic of Imperial Guard. Also, I just happened to have bought the Christmas box last year, so I had these lying around, and I got sick of my Space Marine Death Guard, Death Squad, not Death Company, Death Watch, that's the one. Anywho, so this was next on my agenda, and so the only problem I've had with this kit so far is that, it's got the two variants, but it only has enough parts to build one of them, which is kind of lame, especially since the only thing keeping you from building the variants is there's a weapons body. I guess it means weapons body. That's it. That's the only thing that's keeping people from building the second version. So, yeah, kind of lame, but it gave me the opportunity to magnetize something that I didn't think was magnetizable. Is that a word? Yeah. So, I had a good time. It succeeded for the most part. It doesn't look super clean, but that has more to do with my lack of skill than anything else. One of the things that I've kind of run across, and I think I've talked about it in other vehicle-oriented videos, is that painting a vehicle without an airbrush it's kind of a challenge. Now, I say that having never used an airbrush. For all I know, it's actually much harder to do this with an airbrush than it is with an actual physical brush. I doubt it, but it's certainly a possibility. And there's lots of reasons for me not to get an airbrush. They're kind of pricey. I could swing it, of course, but I kind of don't want to. For the most part, not for the most part. I think the biggest thing about it is the lack of convenience. Like, you have to store that thing somewhere, and it's loud, and I paint indoors. I don't have a garage I can go to, so an airbrush just doesn't make sense for me. And I think that's the case for a lot of you out there. So for those reasons, I just haven't done an airbrush, and I don't see myself doing that. Maybe someday when I've mastered the actual physical brush. So, in 70 years, when that actually happens, then I'll think about it. Or I could just change my mind for no reason at all, and then bam, there I am with an airbrush. But for now, I'm engaging in all these painting exercises with just my manual brush. That way, also, I can find things that work and things that don't. Practices to avoid, tips that'll help you make you more effective or faster at this. Yeah, that's my approach. For this Wyvern, I'm just going to call it Wyvern from now on. I'm not going to say Wyvern Hydra the entire time. It seems silly. I've went ahead and base coated it in bone white. I'm using the Army Painters. Now, it actually may not be bone white. It may be like some other, like a skeleton bone. Yeah, I think that's skeleton bone. Whatever the case. I'm using that color for my prime. I like the way it interacts with the glazes. Most of the time I use glazing for my models. Almost always, in fact, since I kind of stumbled across a technique and saw its results. So if you think about glazing, it's a lot like using contrast paints, and so the color of your primer really makes a difference. It's designed to show up. You can, avoid that if you want. You can, add extra layers of glaze, yada yada yada. There's lots of things you can do to kind of tone that down. But so I changed the color of primer that I'm using, and so it's acting as an undercoat, and I really like the way it's worked. I've tried it with a couple of Astra Militarum, and I've tried it with some Space Marines. The most recent batch of Space Marines I painted is this huge Death Watch kill team, and I used the bone white primer, and I really like the results. More so, certainly, than gray or white or black. So I'm probably going to stick to that for a while till I decide I find something better or what have you. The problem, of course, is that the bone white isn't a very common color, so it's harder to find. I find that I have to use Amazon almost all the time to get my hands on it. I don't have a local hobby store that stocks it, so I'm limited to what I can find on Amazon. Haven't had any problems with that yet, but it's kind of pricey, and if not a whole lot of people sell it, there's not a whole lot of price competition, so I pay what they ask for my little can o' crack. It's not a thing that would happen if, say, for example, I was using white, black, or gray primer, since you can get that from a bunch of different companies. You can't get this stuff at your local hardware store. They just don't pack. They don't they don't stock this in their inventory, this particular color. Yeah. And so I'm using dark stone. It's a color from Army Painter as the primary color. So my Imperial Guard unit uses three main colors, and so it uses three main colors. It uses dark stone. It's this dark brown that glazes really nicely. And then to kind of as a secondary color off of that, I use bone white. So the armor panels on my Imperial Guard troops, those are their bone white. So that's the color of my primer. And so when the models are done, those aren't the colors that show up at the end. I give them a good washing, and so I darken them up quite a bit. It's a pretty interesting color palette, I guess that we can call it. But I wasn't sure how best to apply it to this chassis. It's easy to make these tanks really cartoony. Because, well, if you just look at them, they're really cartoony. Like, the weapons are redonkulous sized. They're meant to accentuate the weapons because that's the really important part of the model. It's for a game, after all. It's not meant to be real. And so, already they're going to look kind of goofy. They start looking cool once you accept the aesthetic and learn to appreciate it. But, just for an external observer looking at these tanks, like, no, a barrel that size on the tank would be twice the weight of the entire tank. You could never move it, or, things like that. So, my dilemma was how to apply those two main colors to get the tank to look cool and not cartoony. And I think I've got an approach that works here. We'll find out, right? So I'm working on this base coat, and I have a good sense now for how I want to paint this vehicle. I went with the dark stone for the primary color, and I went with the bone white for the secondary color. And that's really guided a lot of my decisions about what to paint what color, because it's not always obvious what element of the vehicle is going to be your primary color and what's going to be your secondary color. And so just kind of thinking about how I painted my Imperial Guard, my Astra Militarum units, I've only painted a couple so far, that really kind of helped inform how I was going to approach this vehicle. So I'll give you an example. These guys. This is where the weapons will be mounted. And, I could have chosen to make this my primary color or my secondary color, or maybe a completely third color. So, for example, the barrels of my weapons tend to be a metallic silver-ish color. So which of those three options, or, some unknown fourth, was going to end up on this particular weapon, or this part of the weapon, right? Because it's just kind of the main body. And so thinking about those original models, I realized that what I was doing is that the armor bits were painted in my secondary color. So in the Astra Militarum troopers, you have them wearing like a tunic. It's, basically their uniform. For those of you who haven't seen it, I've painted a couple of, like a squad of Cadeans, and I painted a heavy weapons team, also Cadeans. In fact, all of my Imperial Guard units are Cadeans, at least so far, and I don't imagine that's going to change unless something cool happens in the Codex. So the tunics are the primary color, and the carapace armor, so like the shoulder pads, there's like a chest piece, those are painted in the secondary color. And that really, once I made that connection, then it really helped hammer home what I was going to do here. So the primary color for this vehicle is this, the dark stone, as you see me painting here. And any of the kind of the harder looking bits, like the armor panels are on the vehicle, those were going to be my secondary color. And so when you come up against a piece like this one, you have to make the decision: is this a primary kind of hull element? In other words, is this the equivalent of the tunic on the trooper, or is this equivalent to the carapace of the trooper? So for this piece itself, I decided, it's going to be the equivalent of the tunic. It's not necessarily an armored bit. It is made of metal, and so it's painted kind of the way, think of it as the base color, the primary color. But looking at the overall tank so far, and it's still not done, I've still got plenty of stuff to do, but if you look at this, I have most of the vehicle is in this brown color. But these panels right here, I'm considering these like the carapace armor. These are the armor bits, or the more robust armory bits. And if you look up here, the hatches are kind of the same way. It was a little less clear with an element like this, which is the turret. It's where the weapons sit. And so it took me a little bit of deliberating, but I realized that this was kind of the main color of the tank. Now this element's going to have some metallic elements, and so I haven't primed those yet. And kind of by a similar decision rule, this is an armor cowling, and so that's going to be my secondary color. On the inside, I'll probably retain the same secondary color except for the console. Maybe that'll be a different color. And so by using those kind of little decision rules that I've made for myself, it really has helped me figure out, how to paint each piece, because it's not always the most obvious thing. Beyond what my color is my primary, what color is my secondary, you have to determine, what part is primary, what part is secondary, and where does the primary end and the secondary begin. These are all interesting little questions that you don't think about when you first start off building or painting your model, but they'll come up pretty quickly, and so you have to make those decisions. It's good to have a guide to kind of guide you in those decision making, in a systematic way, so you don't end up with a hodgepodge vehicle. I'm getting close to finishing the basing, but I did want to give you a bit of a warning. You'll notice there's some stuff inside the chassis, which is a really cool detail, except that it's really hard to paint it once you've glued everything down. And I'm usually pretty aware, oops, let me zoom out a little bit. I'm usually pretty aware of where I'm going to have trouble, and so I don't glue everything down. For some reason, I don't know, I didn't pay attention, and I'm paying for it now. That's really hard to get into. So I'm having to be, making some compromises, and so I'm not as happy about that. But you do what you got to do. Anyway, the basing is coming together pretty okay. I've got just a few little details to finish basing. One of them is to finish painting what's inside there, including a bright red for that tank that's way back there. I'm going to do my best to get in there without tearing apart the model. I really don't want to pull this apart. So I imagine that's kind of like an alternative fuel source, or like a supplemental fuel source that drives the gears on the turret. That's separate from the fuel source that drives the tracks of the engine. I don't know. That's how I'm seeing it. Who knows? So you can kind of see how the color scheme is coming together. Obviously, I'll critique the basing once I'm all done. But you kind of get a sense for what this is going to look like already, and I kind of like where it's going, but I'm not entirely sure what it's going to look like yet. But we're getting there. We're getting there. All right. So this next step is one of those that's really easy to overlook, but I recommend that you don't. So you'll notice how I have the two tones, right? I have the dark stone at the bottom, and I have the skeleton bone at the top. But the skeleton bone up here is only it's the prime. It's not actually base coated. So you could, if you wanted to, just leave it like that. And I was tempted, right? But it'll save me only a couple of minutes. And if I skip this step, I'm going to have a tough time kind of repairing things. So for example, here I got a little sloppy. You'll see that I got some dark stone in a place where I didn't want any dark stone. So there's also a little place right there on that hinge on the top hatch. So by going over this with a separate layer of base coat, I'm giving myself the opportunity to fix mistakes that I will inevitably make. Now they're technically the same color, but you can already see a difference, right? I have skeleton bone on my palette and I have skeleton bone as the prime. They're slightly different. So if I have to touch things up for whatever reason, I want to make sure that I have the right color. So that's why you do this next step. The good news is that you don't have to do like a really good job with the coverage. We are using glazes after all. So since the underlying color and the glazed base are the same thing, you're not going to need a ton of it. Any weird variations are just going to be, well, painted over, I guess is the appropriate term. So, yeah, it's a few minutes, but it'll save you later. This technique has already saved me once or twice. Alright, my vehicle is primed and it's looking pretty decent. I went ahead and took care of the priming on all the parts, including the bone white pieces, and it looks pretty decent. I cannot complain. I mean, I can, but nobody cares when you complain, so why bother, right? The thing is, this is just one coat, and sometimes you can get away with one coat, and sometimes you can't. In this case, you can't. You can see my brush strokes. Now, I started the tank off here, and I feel like I got better as I moved to other parts of the vehicle, but I clearly need practice. But more importantly, I need a second coat. I don't think I need a second coat of the primer on the bone white pieces. This looks pretty good. You can't tell there's any variances because it's essentially the same color that I used as a primer, and that is my first layer of base glaze. You'll see kind of the same phenomenon here with the weapon mounts. It's a decent color, but it looks kind of muddy and gross. I need to add a second coat on these for sure. And I also went ahead and used a black to undercoat these parts. These parts will be metallic, probably like a metallic silver with maybe a little black mixed into there to darken it up a bit. So that's what's going to happen here. So if it looks a little funny, well, this is not the actual base color. This is just an undercoat. Everything else looks pretty good. Here are some of the ammo packs. With just a little bit of with the first kind of base layer on them, and this is kind of the armor part that's going to go on the turret. I have a couple of black parts on there. Most of these will be metallic. There's some detailing here that I intend to do. This will probably not all be metallic. Maybe some of it will be. We'll see how the spirit grabs me. For now, I'm just going to go and start working on this second coat. I'm going to apply a nice liberal dose, and that should take care of my weird coverage problems. Since this is a glaze, I don't have to be as sparing with it as I usually am. What I want to do here is make sure that I get good coverage without hurting the opacity too much. I still want to see a little bit of the prime coat, but I just want to see a lot less of it. And as a bonus, This should get rid of some of my more obvious brush strokes. I don't want to see those at all. It's one of the hardest things about doing this, like doing vehicles with a brush as opposed to an airbrush, that you have to work hard to make sure you don't see these brush strokes. And you probably, unless you're really, really good at this, you're probably not going to succeed 100%. But you can minimize what you can see. We're not going for perfection, we're just going for better than average. So I'm wrapping up the basing, and I'm just adding the finishing touches to these ammo boxes that the weapons have. And I wanted to point something out about my plan for color selection. So you'll notice that the green that I'm using it's really bright. It's like so it's not quite a neon green, but it has a neon green like quality to it. It's a little fluorescent, and I don't really like that, and that's okay because it's not what it's going to look like at the end. I picked this color because when I add the washes a little later, the washes darken up how you perceive the color, and suddenly this bright green becomes a really nice shade of green, kind of like an army green, but not army green. And so when you're picking your base colors, you really want to be cognizant of what it's going to look like, not right now when you put the paint on, but what it's going to look like once you put the washes on. Because that's like the end color. Unless you don't use washes at the end, and I don't know why you would admit to such a thing. It's an easy way and an effective way of bringing out some of the details in your model without you having to spend a ton of time doing it. Here's my vehicle with the second pass of the base coat glaze, and it looks quite a bit better. It's still not perfect. You can still see brush strokes down there, but I think this is as good as I'm going to be able to get it, and I don't want it to be too dark. So you'll see like these weapon things, weapon mounts. They're a little darker than I'd like, but that's okay. That's fine. And so now that this base coat is done, I can move on to the next step. And I'm breaking out my Radius brush because I'm going to be kind of rough. I'm going to add a wash. In this case, I'm using Army Painter's Dark Tone, which I suddenly cannot find. Here it is. Army Painter's Dark Tone. And so I'm going to add this on all the brown parts, all the dark brown parts. This is how I've been washing my troopers, and so I'm going to try the same thing with the vehicle, but I'm doing something a little different in that I found that the dark wash was a little too dark. It was getting my models a little too dark. I just kind of want the details to pop out. I don't want it to mess with the color too much. So to the dark tone, I added a couple of drops of the mixing medium, which is this stuff right here, in the hopes that I'm diluting the pigments a little bit. And that dilution will help me keep this brown from getting too dark, while still giving me the emphasis that I need on the seam. So you'll see all the little raised parts on this tank. This is why I use a wash. I don't really, well, not always. I don't always want to change the color. Sometimes I do. But mostly what I want is for these details to come out. Basically, I'm adding shadows without doing the actual work. I'm letting fluid dynamics. Maybe that's not the right term, but I'm letting the properties of the liquid do the work for me, so I don't have to manually go in there and add all the shadows that I want. It typically works pretty well. It's not very often that I think about getting an airbrush, but inevitably when I'm working on painting a vehicle, that's what it really kind of like. I really think about, man, wouldn't it be cool to get this done quickly? And it takes so much work, and there's so much of the brush stroke that's left behind, and it's kind of unsightly. And these are some valid complaints and concerns or what have you. I think that it would be better, faster to do this process with an airbrush. If for no other reason, look at these brush marks. Maybe it's the brush that I'm using, or maybe it's the thickness of the paint that I'm using. Whatever the case may be, on larger surfaces like on vehicles, I always find that the brush strokes are very noticeable, and they kind of distract from the overall, the quality of the model when it's done. Having said that, I really don't want an airbrush. And there's a couple of reasons for this, and I don't know if I've talked about this before in my videos, but it looks really cool. But airbrushes, that's an expense. Not that I necessarily couldn't swing it, but you're probably spending, I'm going to guess, I haven't done the research, but I'm going to guess it's something like $300, $500 to get yourself an airbrush and a compressor and a tank and stuff like that. And, that's money I could use elsewhere. Especially since, I'm not a professional. I don't make money off of my painting or, my YouTube videos. They're not monetized because I have a very small following, and I don't anticipate that really ever changing. If I ever get I have something like 84 subscribers as of today, which is really awesome, and I love you guys for it. That's really cool. But, you'd need a monstrous amount of subscribers for you to make money off of YouTube ad revenue. I'm under no illusions that I'm ever going to get there because, this is a kind of a niche channel. It's a niche channel for a niche game. It's not like everywhere you go, you're going to see Warhammer 40K in everyone's living room. So, I'm also not a professional. I'm not really good at this. I'm good enough that I can, kind of show people what I'm doing. Maybe inspire some people to do something they wouldn't necessarily have done before. But I'm not the guy that people are looking to, rightfully so, for like, hey, how do I get better at this? Or how do I make this look really cool? I'm just not that guy. The other argument against getting an airbrush is that I'm an apartment dweller. I jump around from one city to the next every couple of years, following an interesting work opportunity or what have you, or just a change of scenery, whatever the case may be. I live in different parts of the country, and I don't anticipate that changing anytime soon, which means buying a house really isn't in the cards for me. I'm going to stay in apartments for as long as that continues to make financial sense. If that ever changes, well, okay. And so, as an apartment dweller, I don't have the space for an airbrush setup. I paint on my breakfast bar, and instead of having breakfast here, it's basically my little dining room area. And I have limited space. I have just enough space to keep my little paint stuff and a little working area, a place for my camera and stuff like that. But I don't have a space for an airbrush setup and a compressor and stuff like that. Particularly since I don't want my apartment smelling like paint all the time. I mean, more so than it does already. I think, this may not be a hard and fast rule, but I suspect that if you have an airbrush, you want to be doing your airbrushing outside. Or maybe in your garage. Obviously, you're going to be wearing a face mask and all that kind of good stuff. But airbrushing indoors, like in the place where you live, some of us, exercise there, it seems like a bad idea. I don't know for a fact, but it seems like a bad idea. And yeah, you can get little fume hoods. I don't know, man. It just seems like airbrushing is not for me. The last point for my argument against getting an airbrush is that at least for now, my channel is geared towards people who have a relatively low skill level. That's why you come to see my videos, because you want to get better. You're not at that level yet. And if you're not at that level, you're probably not investing thousands of dollars into Warhammer 40K. You're just, doing this as a little hobby on the side, and, your budget doesn't allow for it. Maybe you're an apartment dweller too. And so you're trying to build some basic skills, just enough to get you to a game and have some good times with your friends. And so my primary audience doesn't use airbrushes typically. At least that's my sense for it. So neither do I. All right, there is the vehicle with the tried adulterated dark tone. It looks pretty decent. You can still tell it's very brown, but it's also a little darker, and it's got all these nice little pools that look like shadows to me. But that isn't as dramatic as what's about to happen. And what's about to happen is this. For these skeleton bone or bone white sections, I'm going to wash them with... Oh no, not this. Okay, so I fixed it. Turns out that strong tone was not the color that I wanted. I wanted a more brown color. So I'm taking this soft tone instead, and I'm adding a couple of drops of water because I want it to be a little more dilute. Yeah, so I added the wrong color of wash, and since I had just applied it, I was able to remove it with just a bit of water. I got my brush really, really wet, and I rubbed it on the wash. that I didn't want, and after a couple of tries, it was gone. So, whew. So, here's what that looks like right now. It's going to dry out a little nicer, and when it dries, I'm going to make sure it dries this way. So I'm going to set it down this way. So I want stuff going towards the bottom as it dries, and that will ensure that it pools kind of in a way that it would if it was kind of grimy or whatever. I've made the mistake before where I didn't attend to how it was drying, and I regretted that almost instantly. So I should point out something here. You'll notice how there's a couple of little imperfections. There's a little bit there where I had to kind of go over it with the bone white. I got the brown, the dark brown, I got it up there where it wasn't intended to go. And there's a similar patch right here. And so I was of two minds about that. On the one hand, I can go back and try to cover that up a little bit better with a reapplication of bone white. But on the other hand, I thought, well, maybe that's what I want it to look like. Maybe it's a little bit of damage, or it's a stain or something like that. So I decided to keep it. I thought it would maybe give my Wyvren / Hydra a little bit more character. I don't know if I'm just trying to justify my being lazy, but I think it looks kind of cool. But the proof will be in the pudding, right? So let's take a look and see if I should keep that. I can always touch it up later if I want, but I want to see if that looks as good as I think it might. And I'm being very liberal with this application because I want my tank to look grimy. Like, not really, really bad, but I want it to look like it's seen some stuff, you know what I mean? So I didn't touch that little element there or that element there because I haven't decided what I want to do with them yet. So I'm going to leave them as is for now. I'm going to wait for this application to dry because I have to do the underside. But if I do the underside right now, I have to flip it over to see it, and that means the drying pattern is going to change. So I'm going to let this settle, and once it's dry, I'll go back and do the underside. I think that's a good approach. Here is my Hydra. And I'm not going to lie, I really like the way it's turning out. I mean, it's not pro level for sure, but for someone with my skill set, just using a brush, man, it looks pretty good. I mean, it looks dirty, it looks worn. I am enjoying it. I even managed to get the leather brown color, which is on my troopers, but I didn't think I had a place for it here. The leather brown is really for boots and gloves and pouches and stuff like that. I was like, well, there's not going to be any pouches on this thing, but there's that little I'm going to guess it's like fabric that's kind of covering that sponson to allow it to traverse. So I went ahead and just added the leather brown on that, and I think it looks pretty good. I'm a huge fan of the wash. I mean, it's a little sloppy on the barrels. It just dried kind of funny. I'm not quite sure how I would do that differently, but it looks grimy as opposed to smoky, which I'm into it. I like it. It reminds me of kind of these bone white things. It looks like there's just this layer of sticky grime over the entirety of the tank, and it's all kind of the same grime. I would normally use like a black. Here, let me turn this around so you can see it a little better. I would normally use like a black color to wash metal components, but I went with something with a bit more brown, and I really like the way it looks. Certainly not for everything. I don't think I'm going to change everything to match this color scheme. But for this tank, looks kind of sexy. I'm a fan. So now that I've gushed over my own work, which, you know, humility is such a burden for me, it's time to do some detailing. And there's not a ton of detailing. Like, I could go crazy and, you know, dot every little rivet. I could, you know, go in there and do some stuff there. I don't think that's the way I want to go. That's not the approach I want to take. I will probably do quite a bit. Like, so these details like this, I would probably bring out with a dry brush as opposed to an actual paint, because if you add too many layers of paint, at least for me, I've found, like if I made these, for example, black, and I did the rivets, and I could always go in here and make that panel a different color. It looks cartoony, at least to me, and so I'm not going to do that. I think here I'm going to just go with a bit of a dry brush, some of these raised details here. So maybe like for the edges, I'll do some dry brushing edges here. I think that's going to be the way to go. Maybe these details down here, it's hard to see with this lighting, but these details right here, maybe I'll give them a little of a dry brush as well, so that some of the highlights show up. But most of the detail that's remaining is going to be like on these weapon deals. Like, so you'll see those little metal rings around the barrels. There's some wiring and stuff on the barrels. And of course, there's the inside, this control of the turret. There's quite a few details there. And so that's where I'm going to be spending my time for the next, for the remainder of this project. I'm thinking also of adding some kind of mud effects on the tracks or something like that. I haven't decided yet. That's a tough call, right? Because if I like the way the model looks and I add some mud effects to the track, if I mess that up, then I've just ruined a tank I really like. So that's something for me to deal with. But time to do some detail painting. So on this particular detail, I went back and forth about my color selection. Wasn't really sure what I wanted to do with it. Like, I didn't know if I wanted to leave it this bone white color, but just kind of keep it clean as a way of, I don't know, showing higher maintenance on the cogitator. I think that's what they're called in the Warhammer 40k universe. But at the end of the day, I just decided, you know what, let's just paint it a different color, because I did want it to stand out a little bit. So I don't have a really good, lore reason or, history reason to paint it a different color. I just thought the model needs a bit more color. This was a good place to add it. So that isn't always the best reason to do something, but sometimes the rule of cool trumps other considerations. So I'm going to go with this army green color just to kind of show, hey, this is a mass-produced item. Even though it is a cogitator, right, and so it's, I don't know, maybe I'm being a heretic by saying it's mass-produced, but there's a lot of tanks in the Imperial Army, and they produce a lot of this equipment, so I think this was a good color selection for this piece. Yeah. And it's a relatively easy color to do well with my kind of painting paradigm, in that, yeah, the initial color is green, but the green wash just kicks it up a notch. It makes it look really, really nice. So that was my decision. That was my thought chain for this piece. I think I'm going to end up with good results here. I've also started detailing some other parts, and it's looking alright. I don't want to bore you with all the details because it's relatively straightforward. There's nothing really special about it, but This part of the model I think is kind of special, so I'm kind of highlighting it here. But the other parts of the model is just I did some dry brushing, some metallic colors to give the hull kind of a bit of a metal sheen. Kind of painting. I painted up some Aquila, very dull color. I don't want it to stand out like they would do for Space Marines. And I'm going to just mark out some of this cabling. I don't have a really steady hand, so this might not be the best job in the world. But I thought, let's go ahead and just do it. So you'll see the cabling that I'm talking about there. There's some cabling details inside the turret control center. So I'm doing that. One thing I will do a little more special is this. It looks like this Imperial Shrine or something. I don't know exactly what it's supposed to represent, but I imagine it's some kind of like a relic for luck or blessings from the Emperor. So I'm gonna take some special attention to that, since it's probably the one thing about this tank that is most regularly attended to. So I'll make it kind of holy looking. I'm gonna add this black undercoat, and then I'll add some metallic color to it. And I do have to do something to that screen. And so I'll do what I normally do for computer screens. I'm going to give it that green CRT look by just really watering down some of the green paint. I want a very light wash, and that's too dark. There you go. That might need a second coat, but it looks okay. So it's kind of like a very slight green tint. It almost gives it a glow. And that's to kind of indicate this is an old-timey CRT screen. And I'm going to make sure that it dries flat like this, because it's too easy for that wash to pull towards the bottom. So you want to make sure it dries flat. All right, our new little tanky friend here is basically done. I've done all the detailing I think I need to do. It wasn't a lot, just a few little bits and bobs like that Aquila, some stuff here inside. There's a little red fuel tank. Just kind of touched up a bit, and most of the details went in here. It's the kind of the control module, and I added a little bit of freehand, like a little grid there to help with the targeting. And I've got just a few details left to go. One of them is I'm going to do some stuff here with the handles. I've undercoated them with, instead of white, I went with bone white, since I already have that. And the last other detail is the headlamp. I've undercoated it in white because there's a little, I don't know, I struggled with headlamps for a little bit until I kind of stumbled upon this little technique, which is, you undercoat it in white and then hit it with a little bit of yellow wash. It's nice and thin, so it's going to seep into the cracks there. I've always had trouble with it until I did it this way, and it works like a charm. All right. I could probably do a little bit more, but everything else after this is, it's kind of a limited return on my painting investment. Oh, you know what, though? I do see a little bit of cleanup I got to do. There's a couple of spots there on the computer panel that need a little touch-up. Alright, so the detailing is done. Here I've got my barrels are nice and dirty. So the next step is to glue the stuff on that's going to be glued on, including these guys. These are the crew. The crew need to be glued on there. I left them to the end. So I painted them previously for a different project. I think it was a test of primers. And they had to be painted separately anyway, so I went ahead and did that. So I'm going to glue this on. There's not a ton to glue, so there's this deal isn't going to be glued. It's going to be just kind of resting there so that it rotates freely. I will need to glue this armor piece on here. That's kind of the only major thing to be left to glued. Everything else is magnetized. I featured that in a different video. So let me put this stuff together and see what it looks like. There she is, our Hydra. It's kind of a sexy lady. I mean, I didn't do a super job on her, but the design is just so, I don't know, there's just something about this vehicle that just, it just hits the spot, you know? And, you know, the paint scheme was pretty simple. I kept it, you know, really straightforward. There's nothing fancy about it, but the emphasis was on getting a nice result without spending a ton of time, and that's exactly what I got. I relied heavily on glazes and washes with just a little bit of detailing there at the end, and I think I've got a really nice looking Hydra. Or do I? If you saw the previous video, you saw, oh actually, wait a minute, it wasn't a Hydra right now. It was kind of in between the Hydra and the other guy. Making sure. Okay. Now it's actually a Hydra. I'm going to move it over to the Wyvern because I magnetized this kit. If you didn't see the previous video, it's not a kit I normally would have magnetized. I would have run it just as a Wyvern because at least right now, apparently the rules are pretty punishing for AA vehicles if you're not shooting at AA. And so most people aren't even worried about running a Hydra right now. But what if that changes? What if the codex comes out for Astra Militarum and there's some kind of advantage to using the Hydra, and now all of a sudden everyone wants their Hydra, I'm sorry, everyone wants the Wyvern, but they've made, oh goodness gracious, one more time. All of a sudden everyone wants the Hydra, but everyone made the Wyvern. So I did a little magnetizing video, and it isn't very difficult. It's a little labor intensive, and I didn't bother with the front facing weapon. Just there's reasons. So I have a nice flexible kit. I did not magnetize the sides of the turret to the turret itself. It's on here just by friction, and this one has a little bit of sticky tack on it because it'll kind of wiggle around. I could magnetize that, but it's a little more trouble than it's worth. There it is. Pretty happy with it. I hope this was entertaining. I hope you picked up a couple of tips on how to make your own Hydra / Wyvern look pretty good without spending a ton of time on it. You've been watching Your Average Bear. Have a wonderful afternoon. And as always, please be nice to yourselves and each other. Peace.